Hey students, welcome to Week 1, Topic 1, Introduction to Deterrence Theory. I'm Curtis McGiffin. I'm happy to have you here. I'm excited to begin this course and begin sharing and exploring deterrence theory and nuclear strategy with you as we progress into the next 16 weeks. The key thing about this is as the bumper sticker here, if one wishes for peace, one must prepare for war. This was a strategy of George Washington. This was a philosophy of John F. Kennedy, and this sort of culminated in the soundbite from Ronald Reagan, which was peace through strength, and the value of deterrence. A lot of people will argue that nuclear weapons don't deter, that they're an expense that we don't need to have because we never use them. It's much better to have more conventional weapons. And I will try to convince you, or at least convey to you, why those might be false arguments. I will tell you that nuclear weapons are used every day. Every day that they sit in a silo or sit in a storage unit, because they exist, they deter. Think about that. Because they exist, they deter. So what is the formula that goes into that? Simply just having a weapon doesn't mean it deters. You've got to know that that weapon works, that you have an ability to get it there, that there's credibility and will to use it. And I've got to be able to communicate that to the adversary so that I don't actually have to use the weapon. That is the strategy with regard to deterrence. How do I do all of that? And how do I know it's really working? These are some of the things that we'll go through in the course as we move on. This particular presentation is really designed to introduce you to some of the concepts, to set the stage for the following weeks, introduce you to some terms and concepts, and begin to wet your whistle, if you will, from the deterrence theory bottle. Get your pencils ready, put your seatbelts on, and let's get going. When we think of deterrence, we really are looking at it in an everyday moment. We see signs like these that really try to convey a deterrence thought. If I do something illegal, there is a punishment to it. It could be a fine or a fee, or something of that sort. Perhaps as a warning that if you come into the neighborhood, hey, we're going to search your bags, so don't bring in any contraband. These sorts of things. These are all various forms of deterrence. Even the interesting one in the upper right corner, which the Conoy Township, which basically says, hey, we're not a gun-free zone. So they're trying to convey a deterrence to perhaps to criminals. When we look at everyday deterrence, it sort of starts off in a manner of, hey, look, I want to dissuade you first. And I'll go into these definitions here in a moment. But I want to dissuade you, which is basically to deter you before you ever have the capability to do anything. And to help with that, I'm going to do what's something called deterrence by denial. I'm going to make something very, very hard for you should you not be dissuaded. And then what we might have then is what we could call a deterrence failure. Normally that's war. In this case, it's the act of a burglar trying to break into the house. Those locks haven't scared him away. And finally, you have deterrence by punishment. Well, perhaps this will. Don't come into this house because the owner or occupant may be armed. Therefore, I may go rob the next house. These sorts of things, because they may not be armed. That is sort of a very, very rudimentary way to think about deterrence in the everyday. As this wouldn't be a college course without some Latin, I wanted to make sure you saw where the word deterrence originated from. And it did originate from the Latin, and my Latin's not very good, but let me try this here. Deterio. To deter or discourage, and it conjugates from the de and the terio, which is from I frighten. In other words, to deter from fear. It can also be used as a term for averting and these sorts of things. So just to understand where that word came from. You're going to read a lot of things that's going to have different definitions of deterrence. Most of them are similar ways of stating the same thing, or different ways of stating the same thing. Everybody has a book to write. They're going to change things a little bit. These are a couple of my favorites that I thought can culminate into an overall deterrence definition, if you will, sort of an amalgamation. The Department of Defense defines deterrence as a prevention of action by the existence of a credible threat. Whereas Dr. Garthoff refers to deterrence as a condition that is created by building a military capability for retaliating. Dr. Landis talks about deterrence is about influencing the perceptions and ultimately the decisions of another party. These are all correct, and they're all different ways of stating the same thing. And then, of course, the famous Dr. Strangelove, 8 Seconds in Dr. Strangelove, where he defines deterrence as the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack. And, of course, Dr. Payne, our department chair, he defines deterrence as a strategy of issuing threats to cause another to decide against unwanted behavior. When I put all these together, in my mind, deterrence is really about the existence of a credible threat. That is capability and capacity to create a condition by which I am influencing the perceptions of my adversary or likely adversary. Okay? I really don't want to use those weapons. Okay? But they're there. And in order to be credible, that adversary or potential adversary has to believe that stuff works, that there is so much of it that I can't get to at first in a first strike scenario, that there is will to use it, and that I believe that as the opponent, and therefore not today. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to attack today. Okay, I wanted to take a minute here to just go over the differences between compellence and deterrence. These two terms are often commingled and misidentified and misapplied. We often think that by deterring, we are compelling someone not to do something, and we often can blur these things together. Compellence is a term and an idea, a concept that was introduced to the world by Dr. Thomas Schelling back in the 60s. Dr. Schelling is one of the fathers of modern deterrence thought, and he laid out this idea of compellence and broke it and did a good job of breaking out the difference between deterrence. It's the ability of one state to coerce another state into action. Okay, into action, usually by threatening punishment. And that's where it gets confused with deterrence. The threatening punishment part, those are the same. But normally what deterrence is trying to do is to threaten you into inaction, whereas compellence is trying to threaten you into action. I often think about it in this way. Deterrence is trying to convince you not to do something. Compellence is trying to convince you to undo something you've already done. It is a direct action to persuade an opponent to give up something. Okay? And often that's done by threatening. Once you've enacted the threat, you're no longer compelling. You're now you're in conflict. So to think about it is that deterrence is really trying to tell somebody, don't do this, it's not worth it. Okay? Compellence is when you now have to go back to that same person and say, basically, you did it. Now, you need to undo it before action takes place. That's really the difference. These two things can often go together. There are compelling actions that you can take within a greater deterrence strategy or effort. But in the macro sense, I wanted you to understand the difference between the two. Okay, let's take a look at some deterrence strategies. This particular graphic on the left lays it out pretty well, and so I wanted to use that as a jumping off point. When you look at deterrence strategies, you can start off with the deterrence by imposing costs. This is punishment or retribution. We often refer to this as deterrence by punishment. Then we have deterrence by denying benefit, which is placing of obstacles and things like that to make achieving one's goals more difficult, if not impossible. And we call this deterrence by denial. Then we see deterrence by encouraging restraint, convincing an adversary that, hey, maintaining the status quo is the best option. And then we add what I think is one that is really appropriate here, which is deterrence by delegitimization. This is one that was started with regard to deterring the thoughts of and analysis of deterring terrorism, and how you might affect world opinion, religious leaders, moral pressures, these sorts of things. But I think you can apply deterrence by delegitimization against rogue states who are looking to go nuclear, and of course perhaps cyber deterrence. Delegitimizing the same groups in the cyber world may have the same effect as in the terrorist world. And delegitimizing rogue nations who are seeking weapons of mass destruction is a quite effective means of deterrence. The fear of losing that economic connection or diplomatic connection, therefore I will not go nuclear, is something that has some value to it. But understanding that that these strategies work best, in my opinion, when you take the ambiguity out. Unambiguous communication, to me, makes deterrence more successful. That isn't to say that deterrence cannot or is not successful when you use ambiguity. There is a time and a place for ambiguity, especially when you don't really have the capability or the will. But for the most part, if you have the capability and you have the will, unambiguity and unambiguous statements and declaratory policy tends to be more successful, as we've seen recently with North Korea. Finally, noting the quote there right above the pyramid, that you must plan to deter, not deter by planning to defeat. Again, planning to go to war as a means of preventing war is provocative. And it can mean different methodologies of capability. And certainly, if you go into the conflict portion, you've already admitted that deterrence won't work, or it has failed. So you must build your strategy with a plan to deter, to actually try to do that. While they may seem like they are one and the same, they're not always as they seem. Talk about the spectrum of force. Think about it in the offense and defense halves here on this slide. On the offensive side, you've got everything up to brute force. And on the defensive side, you've got all the way down to deterrence. Those areas are sub-broken, if you will, under the yellow line there when you look at this. You have this area of coercion. Coercion ranges from deterrence to compellence, and inside of that you have varying degrees of containment and coercive diplomacy. These things have largely a defensive nature, but you can kind of see that the compellence falls within the offensive portion of the spectrum. And once you've have attempted compellence and that has failed, then you have to go into the defeat side, and then which may be any range of conflict, and then you go all the way to the annihilation, which is largely can be described as the existential war, global thermal nuclear warfare type of thing. But again, an understanding of how deterrence fits on the spectrum of force and why I say that it is cheaper to wage deterrence than it is to wage war. Now I want to talk about the strategic approaches left of armed conflict or war. Strategic approaches are what we think of how one country may deal with another country, how they will approach them, how they will approach a specific scenario or problem. There are methods of doing this, and it starts, if you will, on the far left of accommodation and appeasement and works its way to force on the other end of the spectrum. We think about accommodation or appeasement as accommodating or appeasing the adversary, potential adversary, allowing that opponent the freedom of action and capability, the freedom of operation to do the things they want to do. Certainly, Putin's Russia feels that they are being well appeased and well accommodated when they will invade Crimea and Ukraine without any fear of any retribution from NATO or the United States or the UN for that matter. So that is a country that feels it is being well accommodated and appeased with regard to its action within its quote-unquote the near abroad. Economically, it's paying prices. But when you go from there, well, let me just for a second. I also want to talk about the most famous appeasement action was that of Britain, Chamberlain against negotiating with Hitler, peace in our time. In a desire to avoid war, they appeased Hitler's Germany so much that they found themselves compelled to go to war for fear of their own existence. Then as you go forward to the move to the right, you have this precision engagement issue. Changing opponents' values is why we're doing. We're trying to make a difference out there, right? This is what you largely see American diplomacy doing. Sometimes it happens in the UN. Sometimes it happens bilaterally by the Secretary of State or the President himself. Sometimes you'll see this in combatant commands as they work with forces. But it really is about engaging and building relationships. And in an effort, we're trying to really accomplish two things with regard to avoiding threats to the United States. We're either trying to force or make a country to dissuade them from a potential action, or we're trying to induce them into doing a certain action. So when we think about this, dissuasion is in the act of trying to convince the adversary not to do something, but before they have the capability to do anything. So if you think about Iran and the negotiations of how we would work with their nuclear program and desires, we're in the Dissuasion Act. We have been for years. We're trying to convince them that nuclear weapons is not necessary, and that if you do this, you're going to have a bigger problem in the future. But we're doing that before they have the actual capability of nuclear weapons. And then when you think about inducement, it really is about trying to convince someone through positive actions to do something. That could be outright bribery, or it could be other ways of motivating a potential opponent into good behavior. Then we move over to what we refer to as the coercion, changing the opponent's potential action or actual action. We saw this in the spectrum of conflict that I showed in an earlier slide. That goes to deterrence, which is convincing the adversary not to take action. The caveat to this is that it's after they have the capability. So again, look at dissuasion before they have the capability, deterrence after they have the capability. Then move down to compellence, which we've talked about, and then containment, which is limiting the adversary's ability to maneuver. So we may not be deterring them from doing things, but perhaps we can limit them into how they do things, where they do things, and these sorts of things. Many argue that the pivot to Asia was a new containment strategy of China. Certainly containment was the national strategy, if you will, during the Cold War with regard to the USSR. Then as we move to the right, you've got force, short of war. This is the desire to eliminate or deny an opponent's ability to choose a successful course of action or behavior. So if you want to think about it, precision and engagement didn't work. Coercion hasn't worked. They're going to do something. And we're still trying to avoid war. So now we go into this phase where we get into our options of denial, preemption, and prevention. Denial is largely about preventing an adversary's success for attack. A great example of this is ballistic missile defense. It's something short of war, but it is something that's an active measurement in an attempt to deny their success, without necessarily resulting in retribution, although it may. Then there's preemption and prevention. You know, these were the policies of Bush 43, president, with regard to terrorism, right? We were going to prevent or preempt. Well, there's a little nuanced differences between these, and I think I capture this here for you. Preemption is striking an adversary prior to imminent attack, which could very well be classified as something in a denial range. And then there is prevention, which is striking an adversary before an inevitable future attack. So when we look at North Korea, for example, as we look through this, there's different ways of looking at this. So we have failed to prevent them from developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technology. We have now failed to deter them from actually using it. And let's say they've actually launched an attack on Guam or Hawaii or Alaska. So now what? Or they're going to launch an attack. So there's different ways of doing this. With the denial philosophy, perhaps ballistic missile defense, either by ship or by shore, successfully knocks down their one missile that they try to launch. That would be an example of this sort of denial. Preemption would be hey, we bomb those missiles while they're fueling on the pads before they could launch, or sink a submarine before it can launch its missile. And then there's a preventive attack, which is striking an adversary before an inevitable attack. This might be where we know that it's going to happen, and all the intel is collected. So perhaps we attack the storage facilities, the tunnels underground, before they can even prep these things for attack. All of these things may be viewed, of course, as an act of war, even though they are a deterrent mechanism, or the result of a failure of deterrence, or a compellent mechanism. It all depends on where it falls on the spectrum. But just to help you understand how these might lay out. But basically, and we'll talk more about next week, but a state is interested in avoiding war, and it will avoid. And to avoid war, it will arm itself, and it will practice its own deterrence. The prime example of this is North Korea. Again, I'll say it again in the presentations in the future. North Korea is maneuvering itself in a way that it is as a deterrent mechanism to protect itself, its regime, and it's perfectly rational. So the old bottom line up front, even though we're several slides in, is by removing a cause of war, deterrence is a powerful tool, okay, of conflict limitation. Many people will argue of conflict prevention. When we talk about conflict limitation, we're really talking about escalation control. And when we talk about prevention, we're talking about keeping the peace. Also, something to think about is that deterrence is fundamentally about containment. Not necessarily containment in the spreading of ideology or geography, although that is certainly part of it. But it is about containing potential adversaries and their behavior, or containing the possibility or proliferation of their threats. Deterrence is fundamentally complex. What makes it complex is because the success or failure of deterrence varies on its audience. Okay, so if Kim Jong-un doesn't get it, it's much more difficult to deter. If Vladimir Putin gets it, he's easier to deter. The United States gets it. That's why we're easily deterred. although much of that is self-deterrence. We'll talk about that more. So really, the other thing is it's difficult because it's difficult to prove, right? Its efficacy or causality of the success or failure of deterrence is difficult to prove when you're talking to the non-believers, the people who don't understand deterrence. You have to target the adversary's psychological and or decision-making process. And that varies from person to person, to system, to country to country. And multiple actors undertaking a wide range of antagonistic activities in a myriad of environments. We are in this 21st century is much more complex, although not as complex as one might think compared to previous centuries. But nonetheless, it is very complex because we're deterring multiple actors in multiple spectrums of environments, in multiple weapons capabilities, if you will, or conventional versus nuclear versus space versus cyber versus all these things matter. But in the end, it all seeks to counter the desire to dominate, okay, and the war that results from some crazed leader's desire to dominate someone else. Okay, so Richard Betts, and you should have had his reading already. Deterrence is an effort that combines two competing goals: countering an adversary and avoiding major war or existential attack. That is a very good way to summarize sort of what deterrence is all about and why we're doing it. However, what that definition does, though, is it fogs, in my mind, the possibility of whether or not you can deter adversaries that are below major war and existential attack. So that's where it comes into. Can you deter in cyber? Can you deter terrorism? They fall below those things as Richard Betts defines it. Therefore, it can lead one to believe that deterrence won't work against those, and that can be problematic in its own right. Deterrence can rarely be proved, okay? And often, when I think about deterrence, it often is the degree and the duh. It makes perfect sense. But when we don't think about it the right way or apply it in the right way, that can cause us some problems. You may have had the chance already to watch the video on the history of war deaths. And if you haven't yet, please do. It's a great video. This slide sort of captures the culmination of that video, but what I wanted to point about is this slide depicts the percentage of world population versus the war fatalities. And understand that part of what you see in the declining of wartime fatalities in this slide are a little bit mixed, in the sense that also world population is increasing. So while those percentages go down, the number of deaths may not. The number of deaths may actually be increasing because the efficiency of weapons and those sorts of things, which certainly became more efficient from 1600 to 1900 to 2000. But nonetheless, this graphic shows you the number of people who were killed in conflict. Never mind pestilence and disease and starvation, but just wartime. And while the numbers look like they're improving, they may not necessarily be because of the growth in population as well. But what's interesting to note is that in the two spikes here in the 1900 column, which is basically World War I and World War II, somewhere between 47 million and 70 million people died in World War II. It's a tremendous number, well over 2.5% of a population that is at its peak at that point in world history. So a lot of people died. And so what you see here is that at that stark drop-off is basically the dropping of the atomic weapons in 1945, and then this white space, which John Gaddis refers to as the long peace. This long peace really is a representation, if you will, of global economics, better technology and healthcare and all of these things, but because the population is certainly growing as well. But I will tell you that the majority of the reason why this white space is here is because of nuclear weapons and their strategy of nuclear deterrence. It has prevented large-scale conventional warfare that you have seen in the centuries prior don't exist anymore. The fear of escalation due to nuclear weapons has a real effect on the amount of lives that have been saved. Think about that. And so John Gaddis's The Long Peace gives a substantial credit to nuclear weapons and the amount of conflict that it prevents, and certainly the number of deaths that it prevents. And for those of us who want to argue out there in the world that we would be better off without nuclear weapons, I would suggest to you that we've seen a world without nuclear weapons, and it's not pretty. Just look to the left. Deterrence has been shaping international relations for decades. At least modern deterrence has. I would argue for as long as the United States has existed. But deterrence has been not only shaped international relations, it has been the essence, if you will. The UN was created, if you will, to stop war, deter it. They're forcing people to talk through their problems versus reverting to conflict. Deterrence has played a major role, and specifically American deterrence has played a special role with regard to influencing other governments. Look, when you have nuclear weapons in your back pocket, every diplomat in the country is much more powerful. And that's not to take away from the economic might of the United States. That is a major player as well. But deterrence has played a huge role. I like the way Richard Brody talks about it here, in that he says that deterrence refers to the attempt by decision makers in one nation to restructure the set of alternatives available to decision makers of another nation by posing a threat to their key values. You're going to find here that deterrence is only successful when we can identify the values that the opponent holds most dear, by which we can then threaten. So if we're influencing decision makers of one nation from another, that's diplomacy. That's international relations. And if that's deterrence, you can see they go hand in hand. It really is about influencing decisions of other governments. That's international relations. And whether we do it by inducement or deterrence, or in some cases force, it is what it is. And so when you look at these things, nuke deterrence is a key enabler to all other pursuits of national interest. People want to trade with the United States because we're powerful. People want to be in alliances with the United States because we're powerful. People want to be friends with the United States, or don't want to go to war against the United States because of our power. Where does our power come from? Nuclear weapons. It conveys a superpower status, and thus can result in some sort of global hegemony. When you think about it, why are countries pursuing nuclear weapons, the ones that do? Because they want to be world powers. Russia, who is the economy the size of Italy, is certainly considered a world power because of its nuclear capability. If we decided superpowers based on economics, Japan would be a superpower. Certainly not, because it doesn't have any nuclear weapons. China, growing on both. And one would argue that one of the reasons why India wants nuclear weapons is because it eventually wants to be a big superpower. Nuclear deterrence is really key to the hard power argument of what the United States brings to the table, but that can translate into our ability to affect soft power in many different ways. And really then it ensures the ultimate defense and ability to power project. Again, those alliances that we create through our nuclear umbrella and other means allow us to get into markets allow us to project force militarily, and allow us to be around the world in ways that we might not otherwise be. The quote here from Colby is very interesting, that he says, it's nuclear weapons and non-economic interdependence that makes Great War unlikely. When you think about that, how does that play with China? Many people out there think that the U.S. would never go to war with China because, or vice versa, because of the economic ties that we have with one another. Why would we do that? It's not rational. And you can make a plausible argument to that. But if that were true, you would see a lot more cooperation by China and a lot less threatening within their region, as we'll talk about in future slides. Okay, just some quick basics here, as I refer to in Deterrence 101. Deterrence is about averting major war and existential attack. It is not about avoiding all conflict. Okay, the idea that we can still have an invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan or the Vietnam War or these sorts of things, people will say, well, deterrence doesn't work because the United States has gone to war a number of times. Well, that's yes and no. You could argue that American deterrence did not prevent North Korea from invading South Korea in 1950. But I will tell you that nuclear deterrence ended that war, and we'll talk more about that. You could argue that nuclear deterrence didn't prevent North Vietnam from attacking South Vietnam, but it did prevent escalation and prevent that war from leaving its region. It doesn't prevent all conflict. You can argue that Israel has had nuclear weapons for a long time and it has gone to war and not used them, and so forth. So it doesn't prevent all war, but it does normally prevent existential attack. It has defined and refined U.S. grand strategy. We'll talk about more about this next week. The grand strategy of the United States, and has been built around containment and nuclear weapons for decades, and whether we believe it or not, will continue to do so. It seeks to maintain a status quo, but a status quo in the world to our benefit. Why would we want to maintain a status quo that wasn't in our benefit? We seek to regulate competition by creating a shared interest in war avoidance. Okay, so you can think about competition in many different ways. It's economic competition, it's political competition, it's defense competition, but we're trying to create war avoidance. We are seeking to rationally influence the intentions and or behaviors of others through deterrence. This goes to the rational actor theory. Again, we'll talk more about this, and whether or not there are rational people and non-rational people and so forth. It functions by denying benefits, imposing costs, and thus encouraging restraint. Deterrence emphasizes rather than de-emphasizes national power. And it is often an iterative relationship, okay, that requires a lot of communication. Okay, and this is why I believe that ambiguity is less effective than unambiguous statements of deterrence. There are arguments where ambiguity works, and we can go into those things, but it is an iterative relationship. Sometimes ambiguity has its place, sometimes unambiguity has its place. Knowing when to do that, that's where you, the future deterrent expert, comes in. Deterrence can be provocative, and it can be very difficult to measure. What do I mean by these? When we say that deterrence can be provocative, we think about the arms race of the Cold War, or various security dilemmas that go on. You build, I build. You build some more, because my building has become provocative to you, so you feel like you need to build more. That is the arms race. That is a result of deterrence trying to remove or defeat, quote unquote, the capability of the other side in order to make, don't attack me, it's not worth it, I can defeat it already. So that can be provocative in its own right. And it's difficult to measure. is what I'm doing on a daily basis for deterrence actually affecting the decision process of this adversary? Or is he just waking up this day and saying, yet, not today? When you are assessing whether or not an opponent is a threat, you really need to start with looking at their behavior and their capability. So first of all, a threat. A threat can be defined as capability plus intent. That's capability plus a hostile intent. So they got to have both of these in some measurable amount to really be defined as a threat that I need to expend resources against, at least in a deterrence strategy. So one way to look at it is you have the 5 ascending categories for behavior on the left and the 5 ascending categories for capability on the right. So when you look at these, you can kind of make some comparisons. For example, when I look at the United Kingdom certainly has the capability to attack the United States with nuclear weapons, in fact. But they really don't have, so they have a formidable capability, but they really don't have a hostile intent towards the United States. I think you would agree. So they would be a benign, their behavior would be benign in that sense. So while formidable in capability, benign in behavior, therefore probably not a threat to us that we would need to develop a deterrent strategy against. But when we are looking at potential adversaries, there are different, you need to look at these different mechanisms in which to think about this. If you've got a nation that is assertive and very formidable, say like Russia, you might have some cause for concern there. And a deterrent strategy may be necessary to make sure their behavior doesn't move down to testing aggressive or hostile. Whereas when you're looking at, say, Iran, where they have a very hostile behavior, but their capability is still aspirational, now our deterrent strategy may need to be looking more towards more of a denial in trying to prevent them from gaining capability so that they don't become more capable of gathering or formidable. And if you misidentify these things, you're on the road to a deterrence failure. So you really want to give a good, thoughtful consideration to these areas as you begin to think as a deterrent strategist. I wanted to close this presentation out with this great quote here from the late Senator Scoop Jackson, who said sometime in the 1970s that international peace and stability depend not on a parity of power, but on a preponderance of power in the peacekeepers over the peace upsetters. Now, what he was trying to say in his own way was that it was important for the United States, who are the good guys, to have the preponderance of power in order to ensure global stability and peace. If it's not us, who would? When you think about power politics and superpower status, again, the United States has shown it to be the ultimate superpower, not only economically and diplomatically, but because of its nuclear weapons. The U.S.'s ability to project its power, both through diplomacy as well as militarily, has been the difference in lives saved since World War II. We've looked at some of the various definitions. We've looked at how deterrence fits on the spectrum of force. We've looked at how deterrence works in our daily lives. And we've looked at how deterrence works in the strategic approaches as the United States government works with diplomatically with other governments. We've come to understand that the nuclear power of the United States has emboldened all of our other instruments of power. It's a guarantee. It's that hip pocket insurance policy, if you will, that enables us to do all the other things that we want to do as a nation within to meet our own national interests. All right, so next week we're going to look at deterrence and the art of strategy. We'll spend some time reviewing how grand strategy is developed for the United States, what a national interest is, how do you determine what that is, and how deterrence fits within that. And then we'll take a quick look at the following week at the triad, and then move on into the Cold War. So you guys are the future with regard to national security. This is your world, and it's important that you understand how deterrence works, because so many of our leaders have forgotten since the early 1990s what deterrence is and how to apply it. In this world of terrorism, global economics, and multi-polar politics, deterrence has seemed to take a back seat, or at least a confused seat. And in some cases, the realization that old world realism still exists. And sometimes the best way to meet force is with force. In any case, thank you for your attention. Sorry it went long, and we will try again next week. Look forward to it.